Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be listening to the fifth part of What If Sakura Became a Poison Specialist. If you enjoy, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing down below, and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you get notified when videos go live. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video. Chapter 17, Minnow. At least I haven't betrayed my village. At least I can go home to Inari and not be ashamed of what I've become. Can you do the same with Raiko? Tsunami's tone was sharp and unyielding. Shota flinched. I'm trying to make sure she doesn't starve to death. I would sell my soul to any god that asked to make sure she survived. And doom the rest of the village. The rest of your family. Her lip curled into a sneer. May the water not take you. Sakura's tongue felt like lead, voice stuck in her throat as Richo stared at her questioningly. She wanted to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground, and she was frozen in place by an unseen force. What was she supposed to say? What words could possibly nullify what she had done? Are you Shota's daughter? She blurted. Raiko's expression shut down. Unfortunately. She said with a sneer. But rest assured, unlike my father, I'm not a coward. Sakura's eyes went wide, unsure how to respond. Thankfully, she didn't have to. He's dead now, so you don't have to worry about him trying to stab anyone in the back. And he died like the traitor he was fighting for Gato. Raiko said his name like a curse. I believe one of yours killed him. Sakura tried to swallow, but her mouth felt like sandpaper. One of mine. Raiko gave her an odd look. Shinobi. That's what that fancy headband of yours means, right? A hysterical laugh bubbled past her lips. Yeah, that's what it means. Sorry, She was vaguely aware of the other kids loading the last body onto the barge, but all she could see was Raiko. Something akin to understanding seemed to dawn on Raiko's face. It was you, wasn't it? You were the one that killed my father. Sakura couldn't breathe. Couldn't move if she tried, couldn't run if her life depended on it. Calm down, it's not like I'm going to shank you. Raiko rolled her eyes. Dear old dad probably did enough of that. A bark of laughter escaped Sakura's lips as a rush of air filled her lungs. Not only was he trying to stop the only thing that could save the village, he was going after his own family to do it. Her lips twisted into a sneer. He was dead to me the second he joined Gato. Sakura licked her lips. Sorry. I didn't mean to bring up any painful memories. Raiko waved her off. It doesn't matter now. Just tell me one thing. Her tone was sharp and intense. Did he hesitate at all? That was not what she'd been expecting, but it was at least something she could answer. He gave me the option to step aside, sort of. She shrugged helplessly. I didn't take it. Sakura could have lied, could have given her a kinder answer. But Raiko was loading her dead friends onto a barge to burn. Her clothes hung off her body loosely, and her eyes were hard. It would be insulting to try to placate her, a form of pity. She knew that if someone else had tried to do that to her, she would be furious. She'd want the truth. Typical. Raiko scoffed. Always trying to get others to be just as cowardly as himself. She abruptly turned away. Let's get this barge over with. Pushing the raft out into the water was easier said than done. While the bodies may have been thin, there were enough of them that half a dozen homeless kids and one mediocre kunoichi struggled to push it off. The slippery sand didn't make the task easier, and Sakura found herself on the verge of falling over more than once. Jagged wood dug into her hands, likely giving her splinters, and her wounds ached. She kept pushing. Sakura's sandals were soaked, and the edge of her dress had been dipped in the salty liquid by the time they managed to get the barge deep enough in the water. Every single one of the kids brought out a match and lit it. All life is born of water. All people its children. And should the breath of a child be stolen, return thee to the sea. Let their ashes sink beneath the waves. Let their souls find a kinder fate. All life is born of water. All ashes return to the sea. It's a haunting tune, and a familiar one at that. They did funerals differently in Konoha. They buried their dead, even if they were cremated, but Kiri and Wave were islands, and there wasn't enough room for land graves. So instead they burned the bodies on a barge and set them out to sea. The singing was part of the ritual, especially among civilians. A final goodbye and a prayer that those who had passed would find peace. The lyrics used in Wave were different than the ones her father had taught her, but there were enough similarities that she could fake it. The kids dropped the matches onto the bodies and gave one final push, sending the barge out into the sea. Sakura pretended not to see their tears, mostly because she was too busy choking back her own. Haku watched as Sakura sung along with the children of Wave. She stumbled on the words a few times, but never fell too far out of step with the rest of the children. She seemed quietly confident in her capabilities to be a part of the procession. Interesting. Funeral rites weren't exactly something any shinobi academy would teach, especially those from other villages. It was possible she'd researched them on her own, but that just didn't sit properly with him. So why would a fresh-faced genin from Konoha know how to send off the dead in a predominantly Kiri ritual? Haku released a silent breath as the group made their way back on the beach, coming closer to his perch in the tree than they had previously. Sakura pulled what appeared to be ration bars from her pouches and held them out of the Wave children, their expressions apprehensive. Not charity, her fierce voice carried over the distance. What use is letting food go to waste? The oldest boy narrowed his eyes. What if we don't want your help? He demanded. First you barge your way into the funeral, then you make demands. You have no idea what we've been through, so I don't see why we should listen to a thing you say. Her back was rigid. I was offering my ration bars because you need them more than I do. After the bridge is built I'm going back to Konoha where there will be 1 million of these. You're right, I have no idea what you've gone through, I have no idea what Gato did to this place. But you know what? Even if you don't want the bars because of your stupid pride, are you really willing to let your friends go hungry because of it? Her question hung in the air, as tangible and thick as the fog around them. The smallest girl shuffled up to Sakura, grubby hand snatching one of the bars quickly, as if afraid it would be taken away. One of the younger boys approached after a long pause, fists clenched tightly as he too claimed the food and nearly running away once it was in his grasp. The first girl split her bar, handing the larger half to the child next to her who took it hesitantly. The boy did the same, and soon enough the only ones not eating were the kunoichi and the 2 oldest Wave civilians. I'm going to leave this ration bar here, Sakura said loudly. And whatever happens to it, happens to it. I won't know either way. She paused. And I know this isn't my place, but I think Tsunami would love if you visited her, even if it was just once. With those final words, she hiked back towards the village, steps brisk and one hand pressed against the wound on her side. The oldest boy slowly approached the fallen ration bar and picked it up, tearing into the wrapper. He smiled a little when he took a bite, offering it to the oldest girl. The situation regarding Sakura warranted follow-up. He'd mention it to Zabuza when he went back to camp. With that final thought, Haku disappeared into the woods as if he had never been there at all. Sakura woke with a scream on her lips. She was able to force down the sound before it escaped, but it felt as though a mountain was sitting on her chest. It had been 3 weeks since the confrontation on the bridge with Gato, and every time she closed her eyelids, Shota's face formed in her mind. The first night she'd screamed loud enough to wake the entire house, Suzuki sneering when she'd explained why. Naruto had looked concerned, but ultimately, returned to sleep almost immediately. Kakashi hadn't said anything at all. Surrounded by supposed allies and yet you're all alone. Sakura pulled the covers tighter around herself. Zabuza watched the pink-haired brat slowly stretch. She was a noticeable distance from the rest of her team, the 2 boys appearing to attempt water walking with limited success. From what Haku had told him, she knew an unusual amount about Kiri customs when it came to funerals, something that was unlikely to be taught anywhere in Konoha. Which meant she had learned it from someone from Kiri. She wasn't exactly much to look at, but she had guts if her display on the docks meant anything. It wasn't baseless arrogance either, there had been calculation behind those sharp green eyes. She had shit situational awareness though, because he was able to get within 10 feet before her head snapped up and body tensed with preparedness. Her face drained of color when she registered who he was, and Zabuza grinned. Aren't you a little far from your friends? He questioned, purposefully lowering his voice to see the way her shoulders stiffened. Still, she met his gaze head on. They were distracting me. Besides, I'm not working on what they are. He loomed over her. And what is that? Flexibility. Her voice was drier than the Suna Desert, but her posture betrayed her fear. Can I help you with something? Zabuza ran a finger over Kyubigari Basho absent-mindedly. As much as Reika was chum, retrieving his swords is something to celebrate, wouldn't you say? He could see the confusion on her face before it smoothed over in the blink of an eye. Completing a mission with such high stakes would warrant some sort of celebration, I suppose. Her hand was inching towards her kunao pouch, but she didn't grab one. Smart girl. He shined directly behind her. And what would you suggest for a meal? The beginnings of a scream which was sharply cut off escaped the Sakura's mouth, her torso twisting as she simultaneously attempted to scramble away from him and get him within her line of sight. Her hand had wrapped around a kunao, and her pulse was practically jumping in her throat. An expression of stark fear painted her face as her breathing quickened. Well? He demanded. She flinched. I fried squid or something, I don't know. That was probably enough of a scare for the brat, at least for now. If he spooked her any further, she would be incomprehensible instead of just unthinking. While squid wasn't completely inaccessible in Konoha, the village was far enough inland that the purchase wouldn't exactly be common, especially when their dominant meat came from land mammals. However, fried squid was in several Kiri-specific dishes, ones often used for parties. The fact that that was the first thing her panicked brain thought of was telling. Squid huh? He raised an eyebrow. What if I'm vegetarian? Her expression turned flat. Then eat tofu. I'm sure you can figure something out. Zabuza didn't say anything for several moments, instead taking the chance to study her closely. She wasn't good yet, that much had been clear from Haku's report, but she'd killed 2 men protecting the bridge builder when she was fresh out of the Softy Konoha Academy. From her clothes and weapons, he'd guessed that she was either civilian-born or from a poor shinobi family. The dress she wore was too thin and her blades low quality. Not yet skilled or particularly strong, but there was a flicker of something in her, moving almost unseen like a fish in still water. Zabuza was firmly of the opinion that those who weren't strong enough to protect themselves could rot. Even out of war cannon fodder was needed. Pinky certainly fit the bill, and yet. Sharp jade-colored eyes watched him closely, intelligence and defiance shimmering beneath the surface. Zabuza let out a bark of laughter. Come find me when you've grown some teeth, Minnow. I'll show you how to swim with the sharks. Chapter 18, Home Again, or is it? Walking along the bridge out of wave was bittersweet. Sakura didn't know how to feel as her feet traveled over a bridge that would not have been built had she not fought Shota. Had she not planted herself between death and Tajuna with shaking hands and an unsure soul. Traveling back to Konoha was much quicker without a civilian traveling with them, the journey only taking a day and a half instead of nearly a week. The trip was much more tolerable as well. Naruto and Sasuke still fought, but the intensity had lessened somewhat, so she figured she'd take what she could get. Walking through Konoha's gates was anticlimactic to say the least. Sakura had spent so long imagining returning home, and yet the only thing she felt when stepping through the doors was tired. It had been less than 2 months since she'd last been in the village, and yet it felt like a lifetime. It wasn't as though she expected much to change in such little time, and yet Sakura could see exactly how similar things were. How the guards at the gate were the same ones who had seen them off, how the Hokage Tower was the easiest building to find no matter where you stood in the village. How everything was almost exactly how she'd left it, fitting together seamlessly to form her home. As Sakura trailed beside her team, she was forced to realize that she didn't fit here. Not anymore. Sakura was a different person than the one who had walked out of those gates, and she had no idea how to feel about that. The debriefing in the Hokage's office was about as uncomfortable as she'd expected it to be. Naruto just kept going on and on about Wave, painting the story in a heroic, triumphant light. It made Sakura sick. Sasuke had both of his hands stuffed in his pockets as he rolled his eyes at every other word Naruto said, characteristic sneer in place. His mood was clearly not being improved as Naruto went over the details of how he'd saved Sasuke when he'd been knocked out. It wasn't like Naruto went out of his way to point out that he'd come out better than both his teammates injury-wise from the mission as a whole, but he was so damn oblivious it almost didn't matter. Kakashi had given a few obligatory tugs at Naruto in an attempt to temper his more blatant shows of disrespect, but it barely made a dent in his behavior. It sounds like you had a very interesting time. The Hokage said, and Sakura wondered if she was the only one who detected the hint of dryness in his tone. I expect it's all summarized in your report, Kakashi. Kakashi released a long sigh. Everything's in there. He confirmed, handing over a scroll he dug out. They all stood in varying levels of silence as the Hokage read the scroll, expression completely unreadable. It is unfortunate things turned out that way. He said eventually. I see you were a tad forgetful on updating the village about the reclassification of the mission. I admit I would have been hesitant on keeping Genin on anything involving a former swordsman of the Hidden Mist. Hey. That's not fair. Naruto protested. Weren't you listening? We did just fine. And Sakura suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to punch her teammate. They did fine? It was a miracle and a half that they'd survived, much less succeeded in their original mission. There was nothing fine about being forced to face a Jounin on their first mission out of the village. Sakura exhaled shakily, a familiar rage curling in her chest. The Hokage sighed. Regardless, the village has standards that will be adhered to. You will all receive the same pay a shinobi who had completed an A-rank mission would, and that is how it will appear on your records. While both boys looked considerably cheered about that, Sakura had to resist the urge to scream. All that for a higher pay and words on her record? The rest of your reports will be expected within 3 days. I imagine all of you are looking forward to seeing your beds now, so I won't keep you from them. The Hokage paused. Harano, I'm going to ask you to stay behind for a moment. Her heart jumped into her throat. Sasuke narrowed his eyes. Why is she staying behind? He demanded, Naruto's question of her. Why Sakura gotta stick around? Kakashi's hands came down on both of their heads. Quiet down or you'll be leaving through the window. He said dryly. Now, out, the both of you. They scowled at this, but obeyed the command, if somewhat begrudgingly. Sakura was surprised they'd listened at all. It is written in the report that despite this being your first mission outside the village, you killed 2 men in the defense of the bridge builder. Her mouth was drier than the Suna desert. Yes, sir. She wished he would get this over with, wished she could will her hands to be steady without needing to dig her nails into them. When has wishing got you anywhere? He also reports that he has spoken to you about the incident, but you should know that there are counselors available to you should you choose to seek them out. The Hokage continued. And there will be a psychological evaluation in the near future. It was all information she knew, and more than anything in the world, she wanted to be out of this room. I understand, sir. Sakura was proud that her voice did not shake. The Hokage nodded to himself, and it was as though he were looking right through her. The village thanks you for your service. You are dismissed. 3 words had never sounded so sweet. Sakura cried when she saw her mother, curled up in a ball and sobbed because she was home. Her father pulled her onto his lap and stroked her hair until she could speak again, gentle in a way she'd been craving for weeks. She didn't talk about Wave. The day after Team 7 returned to the village, Shikamaru saw her. A bright red dress was carefully folded on the riverbed, and he only managed to see the top of her pink head before she was completely submerged in water. Shikamaru was content to leave her be and continue along within the forest in search for the nettles his mother had requested. The Nara forest had them in abundance, but she insisted they grew best in this area, and so he'd been looking for them before he'd seen Sakura. But then, she didn't return to the surface. Alarm pierced through his bleary mind, grip on the bag he was carrying faltering as he scrambled towards the riverbank. Nearly 2 minutes after Sakura had dunked her head underwater, she finally resurfaced, just as Shikamaru had been about to reach the edge of the tree line. She was facing away from him, long hair covering her back and shoulders. She seemed to be scrubbing at her skin, as if trying to get rid of a substance he couldn't see. Slowly, so not to make any noise to alert her of his presence, Shikamaru backed into the forest once more, scooping up his basket. He was reasonably sure she wasn't going to, not resurface from the water of her own volition. Reasonably. 3 days after Team 7 returned to the village, Koji saw her. One would think pink hair and a bright red dress would make someone stand out, but Sakura had always seemed to fade in the background when she'd wanted to. A bright-eyed ghost that was only visible to those who paid attention. She was clearly running an errand, her arms full of colorful fabric. Sakura's steps were brisk and purposeful, not stopping for anything. If she saw him, she didn't give any indication. Koji wondered if he was imaging the line of tension across her shoulders. 5 days after Team 7 returned to the village, Ino saw her. She was in civilian clothes, hair in a long flowy braid as she sat cross-legged against a tree. In her hand there was a single kunao, and Ino recognized it as a standard issue. The kind shinobi without the resources to buy their own are given by the village. Its handle was worn and old, the metal a slightly off color. The blade was sharp though, recently sharpened if Ino were to guess. Sakura weighed the kunao on the edge of her finger, twirling it almost absent-mindedly. There was a vacant look in her eyes, and it was more unsettling than Ino wanted to admit. Sakura looked different than the last time Ino had seen her, changed in an invisible way she could only sense, and it felt like a loss, though she couldn't pinpoint why. They weren't students anymore, weren't in the protected halls of the academy, Ino knew that, and yet. Seeing her former best friend haunted by something she could only guess made a drop of fear settle into her gut. A week after Team 7 returned, Kiba heard her rough breathing and frustrated growl emanated from the nearby woods, followed by the sound of footsteps hitting bark. It wasn't until a small figure covered in leaves tumbled to the ground that he recognized what was going on. "Hey! Sakura!" Her head whipped up, hands snapping towards her kunao pouch before she seemed to register who had called out. "Are you running up the trees?" he questioned. Sakura nodded breathlessly. "I'm practicing substitution, henges, and clones while tree walking. I'm trying to get those moves down really well since I haven't exactly got a large repertoire of other abilities to fall back on." There's a frustrated edge to her voice that hadn't been there before, and Kiba didn't take it personally. Neither did Akamaru, who proceeded to run up to Sakura and poke at her calves. "Sounds rough," he paused. "You should talk to Shino and Hinata sometime, they haven't seen you in a while and they get mopey when that happens." The tension in her shoulders eased ever so slightly, and she smiled tiredly, reaching down to give Akamaru a pat. "Yeah, I haven't seen them since, before my last mission." Kiba really should have figured it out sooner. Her last mission, the mission which half the village was buzzing about because a seemingly simple C rank and turned into an A rank and had involved 2 swordsmen of the Hidden Mist. Granted, that had apparently been a former title for one of them, but still. When Shino had heard, he'd gone completely still while his Kinkaichu had erupted into a flurry of noise. Hinata had nearly burst into tears, and Kurane got a very peculiar expression whenever it was mentioned. After that ordeal, Sakura likely being bothered by all sorts of people about what had happened, it was no wonder she was on edge. Rumors were hell, especially in a shinobi village. "We're meeting at the last place you saw us eating for lunch today. Wanna tag along?" Sakura blinked, clearly caught off guard. I wouldn't want to intrude." Kiba snorted. "Kurane loves you, and the other 2 might actually cry from joy. They were really worried about you." Sakura turned pink. "If you're sure," she said, still hesitant. "It was the place by training ground 54, right? The one with the giant face on it?" "Yeah, that one." He let out a low whistle and Akamaru rejoined his side. "I'll see you there, yeah." Sakura smiled, and this time, it reached her eyes. "I'll be there," she promised. Chapter 19, A Question of Teachers. Sakura's lungs were on fire. Her legs burned with every step she took, leaves crunching beneath her feet as she ran. In the distance she could see Naruto and Sasuke racing next to one another, their pushes more than playful. She wasn't sure if it was spite or rage that pushed her onwards, but regardless, she continued running. Conditioning had never been Sakura's strong suit. It wasn't something she could outthink, or work around, or fake. You either had the strength and endurance, or you didn't, and Sakura had fallen into the didn't camp more times than she wanted to admit. It was clear she was behind her teammates in this area as well, Naruto having seemingly endless stamina, and Sasuke being faster than them both. Her slower, steady pace by comparison was almost pathetic. Sakura kept running. 15 minutes later, and 5 after the boys had finished, Sakura finally made it over the finish line, breaths ragged and body aching. Kakashi did one of his weird eye smiles, and closed his book. "Nice of you to join us, Sakura." It took all of her self-control not to spit at him. Instead, she took a long swig from her water bottle, willing her shaking legs to steady as she allowed herself some rest. It was mercifully the end of their training circuit for the day, having already done push-ups and weight training earlier. Kakashi always saved the running for the end, and Sakura hated him for it. Even if she had to admit the routine was making her stronger and faster, she just knew he enjoyed making them suffer. He was always watching and calling out mocking encouragement while he read porn of all things. Ever since they had returned from Wave, Kakashi had alternated their training between conditioning, D ranks, and basic chakra techniques like water walking. Her teammates were never pleased when she mastered the chakra control techniques faster than them, but she tried not to let it bother her. They excelled at the physical conditioning where she faltered, so being good at part of their training was more than enough for her. Kakashi was still a lazy teacher, rarely doing much more than giving instructions when training. He still didn't break up Naruto and Sasuke's fights, though the two of them had been getting along better ever since Wave. Even a month after the mission, Sakura could still remember everything with crystal clarity. She wasn't sure she'd ever forget what she had seen, what she had done. Sakura wasn't sure she wanted to. Because it had been horrifying, and she still had days where she woke up in the middle of the night and threw up, but it had also been the first time she had stood alone and survived. Sakura, the civilian-born kunoichi, had gone on an A-rank mission and lived to tell the tale. Oh, she had bled and burned and screamed, but Sakura was alive. It was her that was still standing. But she remembered how close it had been, how if she had been a little less lucky, a little slower, she wouldn't have lived. Sakura never wanted it to be that close again. That was why, after Naruto and Sasuke had left, she approached Kakashi. "Sensei," she said politely. "Can I ask you for a favor?" A single gray lazily slid to meet her gaze. "What can I do for you?" Sakura took a stealing breath. "I was wondering if you knew any poison specialists who would be able to teach me. I've studied the subject extensively, but don't want to apply it practically without an expert to help me." While nothing outwardly changed about Kakashi's expression, she suddenly felt as though he was paying much more attention. "Am I not good enough as a sensei?" he teased, and if she'd had the slightest bit less self-control she would have decked him. Or attempted to. Sakura wasn't arrogant enough to assume she could actually hit a jounin. Still, she forced herself to maintain a polite facade. "Of course you are." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "It's just that poisons aren't your specialty, and I wouldn't want to ask you to put more of your focus on me and ignore the boys." As if he pays attention to any of us. "You're so considerate," Kakashi said lightly, and Sakura's rage increased tenfold. "For being such a polite little genin, I'll tell you where to find one of the best poison specialists I know. Convincing them to teach you is something you'll have to manage on your own." She exhaled slowly through her nose. "Thank you, Kakashi-sensei. Where can I find them?" "You see, there's this little cafe near the Hokage Tower." 3 days later, Sakura found herself in the place Kakashi had described. The air smelled of freshly baked sweets, a faint hint of chai in the mixture. It was homey, and clearly an establishment whose primary costumers were shinobi. It was hard to explain the difference, but there were subtle things: differentiated stores and restaurants that were frequented by the civilian population, and those that were for shinobi. The furniture was hardier, built sturdy with small nicks on wooden surfaces. The walls were usually bare, and all sharp utensils would be dulled ever so slightly. This cafe had all of those things, but it was still easy to locate the shinobi she was looking for. Genma Shiranui looked exactly like Kakashi had described him. He was lean, with chin-length brown hair and a blue bandana over his head. He looked relaxed, almost lazy despite the senbon poking out of the corner of his mouth. He wasn't alone either, which made things more complicated. The man next to him was also a shinobi, broad, with tan skin and deep scarring on one side of his face. He was considerably more imposing than his companion, and she could see the handle of a sword over the breadth of his shoulders. Part of Sakura was tempted to turn around and walk right out of the cafe. Try another time, when he was alone and when they weren't in public. She stuffed that fear down deep and walked over to their corner booth. Sakura stopped awkwardly at the side of their table, resisting the urge to twist her fingers in her dress. "Excuse me? Are you Genma Shiranui?" He met her gaze evenly. "That's me." Her tongue felt like lead, but she forced herself to speak regardless. "I'm interested in specializing in poisons, and my sensei recommended you to me as an instructor." The words had come out too fast and too stilted. Her ears burned with embarrassment, but she held her ground. She had to at least try. "Did they now?" Genma's expression was mild and slightly amused. "Who's your sensei?" Sakura had been hoping he wouldn't ask. "Kakashi Hatake." The unknown man nearly choked on his drink. "Still, I thought he would have sent his team back to the academy by now. I appreciate the vote of confidence." "Shut it, Rado." Genma leaned forward. "What's your name, kid?" She resisted the urge to bristle. "Sakura Harano." "Harano isn't a shinobi family name." His tone wasn't condemning. The plain statement of fact in his voice almost made it worse. Still, she met his gaze evenly. No, it's not. Genma took a long drag of his tea. Nerves bundled in her chest, trapping air and creating lumps in her throat. This was a bad idea. It had always been a bad idea. There was no way a random shinobi was going to teach a civilian-born kunoichi who he had no connection with. Hopefully he would just tell her no quickly so she could leave. Quick rejection and disappointment would be better than this drawn-out anxiety and pain. How long have you been out of the academy? Genma questioned. 6 months. Sakura said hesitantly. Rado raised an eyebrow. That's pretty fresh. She supposed that was true, but she didn't feel fresh. Not anymore. Maybe that was arrogant to say, but her days at the academy felt like a lifetime ago. Before having to deal with Naruto's constant yelling and Sasuke's dismissal every single day. Before Kakashi and his incompetent teaching. Before Wave. I'm not going to teach a brat who hasn't even done any research on the specialization they're thinking of going into. His sharp eyes cut into her. What symptoms does water hemlock produce? Seizures. Sakura said automatically. It affects the nervous system. What part of larkspur is poisonous? The seeds as well as if the plant if it's still young. Her heart pounded quickly in her chest, adrenaline thrumming through her veins. It was just a test. A knowledge test. Sakura had excelled on those since before she'd been able to throw a kunai or thread a needle. Her mind had always been a steel trap. She could do this. If you were forced to choose, would you ingest a flame lily or a hydrangea? Hydrangea. Sakura licked her lips. They're less toxic and you can throw them up to avoid most of the damage. Flame lilies will start killing you the second it's in your mouth. The slightest hint of a grin formed on Genma's lips. What's the difference between wolfsbane and monkshood? Sakura paused for a second before squaring her shoulders once more. Nothing. They're different names for the same plant. He leaned back in his seat. So you're not completely stupid. That's good to know. He was considering teaching her, right? That's why he quizzed her. If he was going to refuse out of principle he wouldn't have wasted his time seeing if she knew anything about the subject she was looking to learn. Why poisons? Genma questioned. Did you just figure if you were already going to have a plant aesthetic with the hair and the flower name, you might as well roll with it? If someone made one more joke about her hair and her name. Realizing Genma was still waiting for an answer she steeled herself. I was the only civilian born in my entire year who graduated. The words are heavy and bitter on her tongue. She said them anyway. I have no genetic advantages or family jutsu or specialized training. I never will. Sakura's voice was the only steady thing amongst the roller coaster of emotions within her. Saying it out loud made her throat constrict, but Sakura didn't think she could stop now if she wanted to. It poured out of her, damn finally broken, and all it had taken was for someone to just ask. Kami, she was pathetic. But it doesn't matter if you have specialized, or know a technique that was passed down in your family for centuries. The yellow jasmine will still make you puke until you die. The prairie crocus will still slow your heart. Sakura shrugged, the motion feeling far too casual and yet the only thing she could think of doing. I chose poisons because anyone can use them with enough time and dedication, and because it levels the playing field enough that I can survive. A swell of embarrassment rose within her the second she stopped talking. She hadn't meant to just go off like that. He had probably just been asking out of surface level curiosity and had absolutely no interest in listening to some stranger bare her soul to him. If she got out of this with her dignity intact it would be a miracle. Tell you what, Genma said eventually. If you come up with an impressive enough observation you've made about me, I'll teach you. An observation. As in something she had noticed about him. It made sense in a way. After all, poisons would likely require good attention to detail, so this could be his way of testing if she was worth teaching. But what could she say? Commenting on the fact that he seemed close to his companion would be redundant and unimpressive, and there wasn't much she could do with what she was working with. Unless. Sakura bit her cheek. It was risky, and if she was wrong it would be super embarrassing. But the signs were there. It made sense. It also might get her thrown in an interrogation cell if she was right. Sakura really wanted to have a poison instructor. She squared her shoulders and lowered her voice so only the two men in the booth could hear. You are either currently, or were formerly a member of RWBY. Chapter 20, is it an assumption if it's true? Genma had just wanted to enjoy a nice cup of tea with his boyfriend. Downtime between missions was precious, and he'd known the second the pink-haired girl had entered the cafe that his day was about to get more complicated. Sakura Harano stood like she was braced for a fight, shoulders squared and chin tilted up ever so slightly. Determination and desperation leaked from her like a sieve, a sort of resignation already apparent in her gaze before she even opened her mouth. She knew her poisons, or at least the basics, and was clearly willing to build off her previous knowledge. Not to mention smart enough to not try to start making them on her own as a beginner. Most would call it common sense, but the shinobi population was severely lacking in that department, so it was notable in its own way. The fact that she came on her own instead of with a sensei or parent was also telling, though Genma honestly wasn't surprised considering Kakashi's everything. Civilian-born shinobi didn't have the pull to find or request a teacher outside of the sensei they were given, so any specialty they ended up developing was entirely of their own power. Genma had taught before, usually Chuyunin or other jounin who needed to know more than the bare minimum of poisons for one reason or another. His interactions with younger shinobi were few and far between. Genin usually had the beginnings of their specialization already, passed down from family even if they weren't a clan. Genma himself had learned his trade from his mother, as she had from hers. As a result, most active civilian-born shinobi ended up as either the same specialization as their sensei, or a jack or all trades. Here stood an academy fresh civilian-born, who had clearly done her research on the subject, and who was likely taking her one and only shot. Genma had planned on teaching her already, but had asked for an observation out of curiosity more than anything else. Unless she said something tremendously stupid, he would agree to instruct her. And then the brat had to go and say, "You are either currently, or were formerly a member of RWBY." If it hadn't been for too many damn years of being a shinobi, Genma would have startled hard. This pink-haired, academy fresh genin, had just guessed a state secret. There was no way Kakashi would have told her, and there was no way she had the connections to find out otherwise. It wasn't something she was pulling out of her ass either. While there was a definite note of anxiety in her expression, her tone was confident. At least in her mind, she must have something to back up her claim. Rado's posture was just as relaxed as before, expression carefully controlled. Genma was probably one of the few people in the world who could read the calculated look in his eyes. Sakura Harano had wanted to get their attention with this observation. She could have easily chosen something more low-key and still convey that she was intelligent. But she didn't. Genma leaned forward. "Well, you have our attention. Now what?" Sakura's heart beat furiously in her chest, adrenaline pumping through her veins as the shinobi in the booth stared her down. Their expressions hadn't shifted in the slightest, but it felt like they were suddenly giving her all their attention. She felt like a bug beneath a microscope, laid bare and vulnerable. "What makes you think that?" Genma asked mildly, and a shiver went down Sakura's spine. If she hadn't been convinced of her observation before, she sure as hell was now. Clasping her hands behind her back to hide the faint tremors, Sakura licked her lips nervously. "Kakashi-sensei said you were one of the best poison specialists he knew, and I've noticed that his view of good is usually everyone else's excellent, so from that alone I can deride that you're very, very good at what you do." Rado took a long sip of his tea, his eyes watching her shrewdly. On top of that, while poison can be used in general combat, they are much more commonly used in assassinations. She continued. "It is unusual for standard shinobi to be issued an assassination mission, especially one that would need to be as discreetly done that poison would be necessary. Those kinds of jobs are almost exclusively given to RWBY." Genma raised an eyebrow. "That's a lot of assumptions." "It is," she admitted. "But I don't think I'm wrong about this, and I'm not going to change my answer." Because she was right. Even if he didn't admit it, she was right. Her nerves were frayed at the edges, but she forced herself to shrug. "So, will you teach me?" Genma studied her slowly, expression unreadable. Sakura resisted the urge to fidget under his intense scrutiny and met his gaze squarely. "I am not backing down on this." An unsettling smile formed on Genma's lips. "What time do you train with your team?" he questioned. "Usually from around 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. she said automatically, a cautious hope building in her chest. "Kakashi isn't exactly punctual though, so it fluctuates occasionally." Rado snorted. Understatement of the century. Genma shot him a look before turning his attention back to her. Meet me at training ground 13 at 5 tomorrow. In the evening? She asked. His grin widened. Guys. Shino and Kiba both looked up from their respective meals as Sakura slid to a stop next to their table. Her eyes were bright and she had the biggest smile Hinata had seen since they'd graduated the academy. I got a poison instructor. She said breathily. Like, a real-life teacher. If I'm lucky, he'll even be a useful one. Kiba choked on his drink. You really don't pull any punches when the senseis aren't around, do you? Her grin was sharp. I haven't the slightest idea what you're talking about. Hinata attempted to smother a giggle behind her hand, turning pink when a pig-like snort escaped instead. Kiba looked delighted by this, and Hinata ducked her head to hide her mortified expression. If her father had seen that, she'd be stuck in extra etiquette classes for weeks. Still, Sakura deserved to have the support of her friends, so Hinata rallied what little confidence she had and gave her a quick embrace. I am so happy for you. She felt Sakura relax minutely. Thanks. Now who wants to bet my teammates freak out the second they catch wind? Shino pushed his glasses up his nose. I would not take that bet. Why? Because it is apparent Naruto and Sasuke have overreactions to everything, even when it does not concern them. He paused briefly. And I too am glad you have located an instructor. Coming from the Abarame, that was practically confetti and a hug. You guys are the best. Sakura said sincerely. And honestly, I'm just not going to say anything and see how long it takes them to notice. Kiba let out a bark of laughter. As if Naruto is capable of noticing anything, and Sasuke could see beyond his own nose. It's a miracle they passed observation and analysis. Sakura let out a sigh. They're only smart when they want to be. Like particularly frustrating cats. Akamaru barked. Are you trying to tell me that you think all cats are frustrating? Sakura reached out to pet the small hound, Akamaru rubbing his head against her palm. Kiba shrugged. Not really. The whole dog vs cat thing is really exaggerated. I mean, don't get me wrong, I do like dogs over cats. I'd be impressed if you could find an Inyazuka who didn't, but we don't actually hate cats. Hell, my mom is best friends with a kunoichi who has like, a million feline summons. Huh. Sakura snatched a dumpling off Shino's plate. I never really thought of it like that. And that's one of the milder assumptions. Kiba continued. Don't even get me started on the assholes who think we have fleas. As if any Inyazuka worth their salt wouldn't take care of their ninken well enough that they got fleas. And they think we're the stupid ones. Hinata winced internally, remembering the comments members of the main family had made about her teammates. There was a reason she did her best to keep Kiba and Shino away from the Hyuga compound, conveniently forgetting any invites anyone but her father made towards them. She knew all too well how biting her clan could be, and would wish their ire on no one. There does seem to be a general lack of understanding about numerous shinobi clans in the general population. Shino said evenly. A woman asked my father if he was made of insects yesterday. It was an unpleasant experience. Sakura made a face. And I thought people making flower jokes about my hair was bad. Inoichi Yamanaka considered himself a difficult man to catch off guard. Being the head of the intelligence unit of Konoha and surviving 2 shinobi wars, as well as raising Ino, had given him enough perspective that little shocked him these days. But as he went over the list of shinobi that were scheduled for a psych evaluation in the next week, his eyebrow definitely rose at the first name. Sakura Harano. That was unexpected. While he hadn't spoken to her since her fallout with Ino, he'd been aware that she'd graduated. His daughter hadn't stopped shouting about the unfairness of Sakura's placement on a team with Sasuke Uchiha for days. Inoichi had considered the placement unfortunate for entirely different reasons, and had begun mentally preparing himself for the day Sakura died. Estranged or not, it would be a difficult time for Ino and uncomfortable for everyone involved. Any team with an Uchiha was more likely to be targeted, and that wasn't even considering Naruto. As Konoha's Jinchuriki and one of the last Uzumaki, there might as well have been a large bullseye painted on his back. It had been difficult not to hear about Team 7's first C rank turned A rank, and if that trend of luck continued, the chances of Sakura surviving dropped drastically. Having a run-in with a missing member of the 7 Swordsmen of the Hidden Mist was already cutting it close. So yes, seeing Sakura's name on the list was unexpected, but not shocking. No, what was surprising was the reason listed. First kill. Konoha had come a long way since the last Shinobi War, but the reality was that the young still had to kill. Konoha tried to keep that day from coming too soon for the younger generations, but it wasn't always possible. Inoichi suppressed a grimace at the image of the young girl with her hands stained red. Her appointment would be a fairly standard one, designed to probe and see how likely the shinobi would be to crack under the pressure and guilt of taking a life. If proven to be unstable, they would be placed under a watch list and monitored. Depending on the severity and how invested the village was in making them a functional shinobi, they would also receive mandatory sessions with a psychiatrist. It wasn't uncommon for civilian-born shinobi to drop out of the general forces after their first kill, some retiring to the reserves and others quitting entirely. The difference between the real world and the academy was stark, especially to those who weren't raised in a family where the morally gray actions a shinobi would have to commit and bear witness to were normalist. That was why, more than any other category of fresh genin, civilian-borns were closely monitored when situations like this arose. While it was unlikely that if they snapped they would cause large-scale damage like a member of UMBU could, their teams might be put in danger. Inoichi closed the file. Alright, that's where we'll leave off for the day. Thanks so much for listening along with me today. If you enjoyed, please like and comment down below. It really helps with the algorithms. I look forward to seeing you next time. Ciao for now, lovelies.